Armor Knights are a classic Fire Emblem class we've had since the very first chapter of the very first Fire Emblem game. And when I was a kid, armors were one of my favorite classes. They were strong, could take multiple attacks, and had amazing animations in the GBA era. As I've played the game more though, armors have more often than not fallen out of my army, or worse, never even made it off the bench in the first place. This is because armors have a few innate qualities that tend to make them struggle in many games in the series. Let's look at what some of those are. First, armor units typically have the lowest move in the game, even lower than other foot units. Often foot units like mercenaries and fighters have 5 move while armors have 4. In games where flyers and cavaliers excel, which is many Fire Emblem games, foot units can already struggle to keep up. And if you're stuck on 4 move, forget about it, you're getting left behind. This is the most common issue that armors face, and it's relevant in most games where the player is powerful enough to move quickly, though certain map and enemy design choices can mitigate this issue, but I'll get into those solutions a little later. The second issue that armors commonly face is that they don't get good enough stats to compensate for their lower move. Even in games where armor's move issues are significant, players will still use them anyway if their stats are good enough. But usually they aren't. Frequently, Armor Knights aren't that much bulkier than other units in your army, but their speed is so slow that they get doubled. Particularly against tougher enemies, this can sometimes result in an Armor Knight taking more damage than a less defensive unit that doesn't get doubled. Armor Knights are usually also not strong enough to one-shot enemies. This can actually be valuable in early game, when you need units to set up kills for your investment projects, but eventually you probably want your combat units to be able to one-round some enemies, and Armor Knights can struggle to get there. Basically, taking an extra physical hit or 2 often isn't worth the trade-off of dying to magic users and one-rounding very few enemies. Lastly, armors can struggle in games where enemies are weak. In games with really low power enemies like Sacred Stones, lots of units can take multiple hits, which means the extra bulk from armors just isn't necessary. In these games, a lot of your units are also often one-rounding, so you don't really need a slow, extra bulky unit that can't really one-round anything when you could just be decimating every unit with someone like Seth or Garrick, who can still take a hit just fine. Despite these issues, there have been a few standout Armor Knights in the series' history, and I want to look at how those knights have managed to perform well and leave a positive impression despite their limitations. Basically, if we know the problems with Armor Knights, let's look at how some games have solved them. In Fire Emblem 7, a game where horses dominate and movement is king, the early Armor Knight, Oswin, is very relevant in the early game because his stats are stellar for his join time. Look at him in comparison to other units. He's bulkier, he's stronger, and his speed is low enough that he doesn't double, but slow to mid-speed enemies don't double him either. In early Hector hard mode, this is a great boon because he can do a lot of combat while your other units are growing. And since he doesn't double much, he can help set up kills for other units that want kills. Oswin still usually eventually gets replaced in my playthroughs, but he gets opportunities to shine in the beginning of the game because of his impressive stats, even with his poor movement. Also helping Oswin is that most maps in early Fire Emblem 7 make sure there's something for a low move unit with good combat to do. In his join chapter, enemies come directly to Oswin and Hector's start location, and you'll need Oswin to help take them out and protect Sarah and Matthew, who are much squishier. In Chapter 13, if you're worried about being overwhelmed by enemies, there are 2 one-tile choke points that you can use on the northern route of the map that makes things a little easier, albeit slower. 13X is a defend map and there's multiple points for someone to choke. Chapter 14 has a close-by village and a bunch of horses that come fight you. Oswin is a great candidate to deal with those as Marcus goes to the far village to save Priscilla. Chapter 15 is another defend map. You get the idea at this point. Early game FE7 maps have tasks that a unit needs to do where movement isn't that emphasized. It also frequently has multiple objectives, so you appreciate having a strong combat unit that can handle the less important objectives, while Marcus handles objectives where mobility is most important. Oswin's role eventually becomes less important. Once you have more good combat units, a second paladin, or a trained flyer, there's less need for a slow but strong combat unit. But he's a useful contributor for all of their early game, even if you don't use him long-term because of his higher stats relative to his peers, and early maps giving him something to do despite not being able to keep up with your most powerful unit. We can contrast this with Gilliam in FE8. Gilliam comes with only 2 more strength and 3 more defense compared to Franz, the cavalier who joins at the same time, so he's a little stronger, but not strong enough to make up for his lack of move. He's also hurt by the maps around his join time and the enemy quality of Sacred Stones. A lot of early Fire Emblem 8 maps don't have meaningful side objectives that you need Gilliam's bulk to do. His join chapter is a straight path to the throne that Seth easily solos. Chapter 2 is full of axe users, so the little combat Gilliam gets to do isn't that exciting. Chapter 3 has some treasure chests to pull you off the direct path to the boss, but they're only guarded by one enemy that your thief can deal with on their own. The first map where Gilliam really has a role is in Chapter 5, where you might want to use him to choke either path to the left to help feed kills to whatever growth units you've decided to use. There just aren't a ton of side objectives that can't be handled better by someone else, because Gilliam is both slow and his combat isn't really better than anybody else's, and it quickly becomes worse once other units start doubling. His stats just aren't good enough for the player to want to slow down to use him. Looking at Osmond and Gilliam, we can see that to keep armors important in the early game, two things are required. First, the armor needs to actually have good stats, and not just good, they need to be better than their 5-move counterparts by a meaningful margin. Second, there has to be something for armors to do. This can mean combat-heavy side objectives that aren't too far from the starting location, or even just reinforcements that spawn near your start that need to be dealt with. It can also mean strong enemies that you want a bulky unit for. In early Conquest, Effie is a great boon to your army because enemies are strong, and you really appreciate a unit that can take a hit without dying or immediately needing healing. Fire Emblem Fates also mitigates armor issues with skills. Wary Fighter is a particularly notable one that makes it so both the user and the enemy can't double. This helps mitigate armor's lower speed and ensures that their bulk is great even against fast enemies. The key differences between Oswin and Effie versus Gilliam are that Osmond and Effie have significantly more bulk than their counterparts, and the maps around their join have tasks that they can perform. Effie also benefits from the movement tools Fates has to offer. She can pair up with a more mobile unit that can easily ferry her where she needs to go. Similarly to Effie, Wolf and Sedgar in Shadow Dragon also really benefit from enemies being difficult. In Shadow Dragon Hard 5, enemies hit really hard, and for a lot of the game, most non-armored units can take 2 hits at most. A good armor like Wolf and Sedgar reclassed into General gets so tanky that they can actually start to take 0 to 3 damage from most enemies. This makes high enemy density Shadow Dragon maps a lot easier, assuming that you aren't just warp skipping all of them. Wolf and Sedgar do represent a different sort of problem with Armor Knights though, which is that you don't want them to be so good that they become over-centralized. Wolf and Sedgar can easily become some of the strongest characters in your army, but the problem is they become so strong that Shadow Dragon becomes a little boring. Strategy centralizing a strong armor unit often involves slowly trudging through the map to a choke point, baiting as many enemies as you can, and then moving on to the next choke point. While this strategy can be effective and reliable on some maps, it's also not very engaging. This can be avoided in a few ways without having to nerf the armor's stats though. First, you can just include time-sensitive objectives on your map that an armor isn't going to make it to in time, or spawn reinforcements behind the player that will force them to either move faster or engage in combat with units other than their armor. Alternatively, you can also include some magic units that do well against armors so that you have to use some of your other units to get through those parts of the maps. Basically, you want armors to be useful on every map, but not so useful that they're over-centralizing, because strategies centered on armors can be a little boring if you have to do them for more than 1 or 2 maps in a row. Another thing that can help armors out is smaller maps. The bigger maps are, the larger the gap between your higher move units and your lower move units becomes. In the extreme example of this, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War, it's just impossible to keep Arden up with the rest of your army as they dash across the countryside and leave him in the dust. Maybe this would be okay for Arden if defending castles was a little more important, but in practice, Arden just doesn't get to see much use. In smaller maps, knights don't get left behind quite as badly, and they can reach objectives a little quicker, even with their low move. One last thing that has helped armors since Fire Emblem 8 is the Great Knight class. Armors become a lot better in Fire Emblem games with the Great Knight promotion path because it provides decent move and a horse while retaining their stat profile. But this doesn't help before promotion, and it doesn't do much for the general class. Still, units like Osmond and Effie show that armors can have a role in Fire Emblem games even with their low mobility as long as they have good stats and maps that accommodate them. A common suggestion on how to fix armors that I haven't discussed yet is to just give them normal infantry movement, but there are a couple reasons I don't like that. First, I think the low movement is part of the identity of the Armor Knight class, and some flavor would be lost by giving them the higher move speed. Second, I don't think that just giving them an extra move would really fix Armor Knight issues anyway. In games where Armor Knights are bad, it's usually because their stats aren't up to snuff. weaker armor knights often just don't have the stats to succeed. A unit that gets doubled and fails to one round will struggle to see use even if they do have infantry move. So my preference is to just give knights great stats that will help them compensate their low move by having excellent combat, and then designing maps with objectives where that combat is useful. Another consideration is that whatever changes we make to knights apply to the enemy as much as they do to players. Enemy knights and generals can sometimes be some of the more difficult units to deal with, as you may need to bring a magic user or effective weaponry instead of just using your main combat carry with an iron lance. But their low move allows you to avoid enemy armors at times, or bait higher move enemies away from them so that you can deal with the armors separately. This dynamic would change with an extra point of move. Technically, you could buff player armor movement and not enemy armor, but I like it when enemy classes work the same way yours do. I think it makes learning the game a lot more intuitive. Basically, I favor changes that make knights relevant with low move instead of giving them extra move, because I worry that by giving knights an extra point of move, we would just be killing a unique class to reinvent the soldier. The reason I place a lot of value on retaining the identity of the armor knight is because whether armors are good or not in an efficient context, they are a well-liked class, and I think they have a role in slower playthroughs. Earlier this week, I asked people on Twitter what they thought about armor knights, and while there were a lot of people noting the problems with them that I mentioned earlier, there were two other common sentiments. A lot of people responded talking about how much they love armor knights. Whether it be the fun animations, the joy of hearing the zero damage plink noise, or just the idea of showing them favoritism until they can juggernaut through the maps, armors are a lot of fun for a lot of players. Just look at how many people love FE6 Wendy or General Amelia in Sacred Stones. Even really weak armors can be fun for a lot of players. The second theme a lot of people pointed out was that if you don't care about efficiency and play at a slower pace, then there's value that you can get out of armor knights in their current state, and I think that's usually true. In a lot of games, especially ones with few time-sensitive objectives, knights can be great for slowly baiting out units for the rest of your army to swarm. This isn't my favorite way to play, but it's a way that armor knights can make the game easier for people that don't like to play super fast. Wolf and Sedgar and Shadow Dragon are a good example of this. If you play the game fast, their stocks go down quite a bit. They don't get all the levels they want, and it's hard for them to keep up with units like Sita and Jagan as they rush through the map or get warped to the boss. However, if you're playing at a slower pace, you can get a lot of value out of Wolf and Sedgar in general because their defense gets so high that they can take on even some of the toughest enemies in Shadow Dragon Heart 5. Wolf and Sedgar are a bit of an extreme example, but I think the principle applies to most games where the Armor Knight has acceptable to good stats. They can be a boon to players that aren't worried about efficiency or saving turns. To me, Armor Knights being fun to use for a lot of people and having a role for players that want to play at a slower pace are pretty good reasons for them to exist in their current form, even if that usually means that they aren't going to be the best in more efficient contexts. So in my view, the solution to the problems with Armor Knights are actually fairly simple. Just give them better stats. They should have better stats than their 5-move counterparts, and they should have a little bit of speed so that they don't get doubled by everything, or Wary Fighter if you don't want to give them speed. If Break from Fire Emblem Engage returns in future Fire Emblem games, I think being immune to that is also a great niche for armors to have. Although armors will rarely be good in more efficient contexts without mobility changes, they can still fill a healthy niche for slower play and can even see use in efficient play on maps with combat-heavy side objectives or on maps where enemies come to you. But what do you think about armors? Are they perfect how they are, or would you change some things about them? Let me know in the comments, or if you want to chat about it more, consider joining the community Discord, which is linked in the video description. Lastly, if you enjoyed the video, consider liking or subscribing so that you never miss an upload, and have an awesome week.